What I want to do for the next hour is convince you that communicating with the public is important for you, no matter who you are and what you do, and also give you some tools to begin that process of communication. To start, I just wanted to give you a little bit of background about me and journalists in general today. It used to be that somebody might be able to spend 6 or 7 months on a story, and there's still a few people out there, but most of us are doing a lot of different things simultaneously. So just in the last few weeks, I've written at least 5 stories, I lost count, for USA Today on Ebola. Also did a story the night Robin Williams committed suicide about suicide, mental health. I did a long story for nationalgeographic.com on Ebola. I've written 3 pieces for Discover, short pieces. I'm doing a piece for Nature on liver cancer. I did a piece for the Globe on a wellness program at the Museum of Science, aging, sleep problems, Alzheimer's. I'm working on a New York Times piece on stem cells, and I did something on infectious disease for a science magazine. So that's just in the last 2.5 weeks, maybe. And I was off one of these weeks, officially. So you can see that I can't possibly know that much about any one topic. I'm writing a wide range of subjects, and this is actually a lot on public health, but I write across a lot of different topics. So when you are talking to journalists, if you are talking to a journalist, know that we're not idiots, but we don't have anywhere near the kind of background that you have on a particular subject. So you have to speak to us the way you would speak to, I like to say, your grandmother. I don't know if anybody's grandmother was a Nobel Prize-winning scientist, but in general, your grandmother. Also, you should know in journalism right now, it's a very difficult time. So I pulled a couple of stats. Time magazine since 2008, has dropped from a circulation of nearly 120,000, almost in half, virtually in half. The newspaper revenue has fallen off basically fallen off a cliff, as you can see in the upper left. And yes, digital helps. People are reading news online, but you can see from the red line that it doesn't help enough. Just yesterday, my editor at USA Today was laid off with no notice. He had an hour to clean out his desk. He'd been working for that organization for 41 years. So that gives you a sense of the climate in which I am operating. The bottom one is also, I should say that a lot of stories are getting shorter. I got a memo from USA Today a couple of months ago that said that anything longer than 600 words, forget about it. Most things should be 300 to 500 words. So you can see in that lower graphic on the left that stories are getting shorter. This is the number of stories over 2,000 words. And even the LA Times, the New York Times, these are the major national publications. Even in those publications, the stories are getting substantially shorter over time. You need me? Okay. 40% in 10 years decline in newspaper jobs. So not only are we not experts in things, but we're stressed, harassed, and nervous about our jobs. Also, I wanted to put some of what we do into a broader context. 46% of Americans believe God created the earth in its present form within the last 10,000 years. People in America do not understand evolution. DNA is worse. 20% of Americans can't answer correctly, does the earth revolve around the sun or the sun revolve around the earth? So these are the people you're talking to. Hopefully your grandmothers knew that, but these are the people, when you're trying to communicate with a general audience, these are the people you're communicating with. And there are people whose minds you're never going to change. Obviously, the anti-vaccination people are not going to suddenly decide that vaccinations are a good thing. But you need to be able to present information at least. My feeling is I need to present information in a way that they can at least understand it, so that if they want to see the science to make informed decisions, that there is some reputable information out there for them to make that decision. So I want you all to think a little bit for 2 minutes about how would you explain your own work to somebody who doesn't understand evolution or DNA or the scientific method in general. So there are pens in front of you and some little Post-it notes. If you want to just spend 3 minutes, just write a sentence or two or even a couple of words and think about how would you explain what you do all day to somebody who I just described, to the typical American. So I'll time you. Okay, anybody brave enough to share? You want to go? No? Okay. Sorry. So let me just try to summarize that or repeat it for the microphone. You ask people who are having knee and hip operations about their pain so that you can keep track of it for them. Okay. Anybody else? Okay. So you help people get the least amount of radiation possible when they're getting scans. Right, great. Anybody else brave enough to go? Yes. Great. So you study the cells that come together to close a wound. Right. And how they come together without letting the bugs in, the microbes. Great. So, yep.
I would just say one of the pieces, try to use as little jargon as possible.
Right. I'm definitely getting to that. But you can see how what you just described to your 6-year-old is understandable to everybody, but might not be, if you use scientific terms, you could lose all of us probably in this room if you wanted to. And I have some examples of that. So, yeah. Here's an example from the New York Times. This was an excerpt from a chemistry class that was trying to teach people how to speak, how to communicate more simply. So this one student was writing to her peers at the American Chemical Society, using laser-induced temperature jump techniques, I focus on elucidating the kinetics and mechanism of dihydrofolate reductase as a model system to better understand how enzymes work. Did you all get that? Okay, 1 or 2 of you got that. Good for you. And, but a lot of people, even if you're speaking to colleagues who aren't chemists but have PhDs, they may not get that. And that's something that I think transcends talking to journalists. Today, in this era where you're expected to do interdisciplinary work, I think it's really important for scientists of all disciplines to be able to speak a language that others can understand. I've had people, when we started a brief section in the Boston Globe 8 years ago, we had doctors come up to us and say, cardiologists, and say, I finally understand what the cancer docs are doing. Thank you. And so it's not that people are stupid. It's just that you speak in a jargon, in a language, and have years of training to do that. And you forget. It's really easy to forget that not everybody else has that. It's human nature to forget that not everybody else has that background. But part of communicating your information is stepping outside of that background and explaining it. And a 6-year-old is great, I think, for that. So this woman went on to say, to biologists and mathematicians at an American Association of Advancement, AAAS meeting, she might say, by enhancing our understanding of enzymes, we hope to advance many fields, enzyme design, drug discovery, and chemical synthesis. So a lot of people could probably understand that. I didn't like the one she did for neighbors, so I wrote my own. To neighbors, this model lets us design and control chemical reactions, develop new materials, and produce everyday products more efficiently. I think that's something that I could write a sentence like that in a newspaper and assume that most people could understand it. The 3rd grade version is the longest, interestingly, which I wouldn't necessarily do if I were talking to a 3rd grader, but inside the bodies of every living thing, including you and me, are tiny little machines called enzymes that do a variety of things. They help break down food, fight disease, and help our bodies grow. We aren't completely sure how they work, but I'm trying to understand them so that one day we can make them do whatever we want them to do. So again, you can see how the language, getting rid of the jargon, getting rid of dihydrofolate reductase, whatever that is, you can explain that to me later, makes things much clearer to people. I find, I probably shouldn't admit this, but when I'm doing stories, I often avoid the PhD students, even the first authors, because I find that the senior authors can pull back much better and explain to me the big picture in a much better way because they've had more years of practice, probably. The PhD students are so focused on getting their dissertations, getting their work done and what they did in the lab yesterday, that it's very hard for me to understand the bigger picture by talking to them. And so that's something you might want to, if you are a PhD student, something you might want to work on. And I know you don't get a lot of support for that in the scientific community, but it's something you may want to think about as you go through your career, is how can you pull back a little bit, explain what it is that matters. I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's an astrophysicist once. She was complaining that the media doesn't write about her work in binary star systems. And I said, okay, explain to me why should people care about binary stars? And she said, I haven't thought about that in 15 years. And it's like, how am I can't do that work. She has to do that work in order for me to understand it. And that's what I'm trying to encourage you guys to do today, is do that work. As you're going through your regular daily activities, take a step back sometimes and think about how could you talk about it to a 6-year-old or your grandmother or your neighbor over the back fence. Oops. Okay. Oops, we did that already. So, and again, a lot of what I do is what you just did about your own work, is I try to talk to scientists and help them. I can be a go-between. I can be the voice at the biologists and mathematicians at the AAAS meeting. I can understand that level generally and then translate it 1 or 2 steps down, but I can't go from this top level because I don't know what these terms mean. And also know that you're not the only one putting stuff out. If you have a study that comes out, I get maybe 50 or 60 on a typical day, studies that come out do you know about Eureka Alert? AAAS, American Association for the Advancement of Science, every day puts out a list of studies. I get some under embargo, which means they're coming out in the next few days, and I can see them as long as I promise not to write about them. And they also list all of the studies coming out that day in publications or around that time. So this was Sunday of Labor Day weekend, okay, not exactly prime time for studies. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. There were 8 studies that day, which is a really light day. Usually, like I said, there are 50 or 60 on a daily basis. So I've got this fire hose of studies coming at me on a daily basis. And one of the most difficult jobs that I have is trying to decide what to cover and what not to cover. So what I do, I try to look at this every day. I don't always succeed. And I'll look at, for a clinical trial, say, was it a big trial? Was there a placebo-controlled double-blind arm? I'll look at the kinds of basic. I'm educated enough now to understand basic science and understand what's a good study to some degree and what's not. And I'll look for things that people care about. So there's a study, I'm actually not sure I'm going to write about it, but it's out today, about viruses. If you put a virus on that door handle, in 2 hours, it's going to be 60% of the people in this building will have gotten that virus on their hands. So incentive to wash your hands. But, to me, that's a cool story because everybody can relate to that story because everybody touches door handles. So that's going to jump out at me from this list, from this fire hose of stories. So when you're thinking about your own work, what is it that takes that leap? We call it the hey Mabel. What's going to make somebody choke on their Cheerios, when they're reading at breakfast? What's going to really stick with them all day, when they go to the bathroom and they start to walk out without washing their hands? Maybe they'll think about that story. So to stand out, you need to have something important to say on a topic of interest relevant to a lot of people. This isn't rocket science, but, and you need to be able to say it in a way that people can understand. So if you were doing a different study, but you wanted to say, or let's say you're a public health official and you want to say, here's why you need to wash your hands, you might cite this study later, and say, here's why you want to wash your hands, because you're going to be touching the same doorknob as everybody else in the building. And those kinds of metaphors and examples are really helpful to me as a journalist. Also extremely helpful to me are personal stories. I know that as scientists, you're sort of bred to have a distance between yourself and your science, and this isn't about me, it's about the team, and we're all in this together. And I appreciate that, and I think it's wonderful that you're collaborative and that you give credit to other people. But when I'm writing a story, I need a story. I need to tell how you discovered this you spent 20 years convinced that, Judah Folkman spent 40 years, I think, convinced that anti-angiogenesis was the secret to cancer, that sucking off the blood supply of a tumor was going to cure cancer. And people thought he was nuts, and he didn't get funding, and he toiled in, obscurity for years. And then he finally had some successes, and he was on the front of the Sunday New York Times, in part, because of that drama. Because here was this lone wolf who toiled for decades and then succeeded. He didn't cure cancer, although he may have cured he did a lot for macular degeneration, maybe more than cancer. But in any case, there's a great human drama there that elevated that story from study shows some success against cancer to the front page of the Sunday New York Times about a guy who succeeds, a David and Goliath kind of story about a guy who succeeds against time. So those kinds of personal stories and narratives really help. I'm also looking for stuff that's new. I know, again, science is different than journalism. You're trying to add to the body of information. Nothing that you do is definitive. Nobody should change practice based on this one study. But that's not what I'm about. I'm about, encouraging you to wash your hands. But I pick out one thing and elevate it and make it important. Now, I will put caveats in. I will say, nobody should start taking statins based on one study, but I'm still going to be more interested in that first study that shows that statins are lifesavers. There's my Hey Mabel line. I'm also looking for things that evoke a strong emotional response. I did a story a couple of weeks ago for USA Today, pitched to me by Kaiser Permanente Health System. They had a patient came in and was chatting with a nurse. He had some cancerous removed from his face, and he was chatting with the nurse, and he was an older man, and he said, I have no family. She was asking him about his family. I have no family. Oh, that's too bad. But I said, I have no family, but I used to have a brother. And the nurse was like, you used to have a brother? What's that about? And he said, yeah, we were in an orphanage together, and when I was 13, my aunt came and picked me up, but left him there, and I've never seen him since. And I've looked for him, but I've never been able to find him. So the nurse says, oh, you should meet my friend. She's a technician down the hall. She used to be a private investigator. And the guy's like, no, I don't want to be a bother, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, he comes back a few weeks later for his checkup and ends up talking to this PI, former PI, who says, let me work on it, and finds the brother. And they get reunited. Like, I'm getting chills just describing that story. There's so much drama and interest, and we can all imagine what it must have been like to be separated for 70 years apart from his brother and then be reunited, and what that was like. And his brother, he never had kids, but his brother had 4 or 5. And so now he's got a family. A man who was totally alone in the world now has a family who loves him. And, so that's the kind of human drama story that we're all, I think, interested in, and that I can make journalism out of. Another thing that's a good story, I always joke, but it's not really a joke, is whatever happened to your boss on the way into work this morning. So I have definitely had days where, pothole eats boss's car, you're writing about potholes today. There was a lot of interest in the Boston Globe for a while in prostate and breast cancer because the editors were of an age where they were worried about that. Colon cancer, anyway, so things that hit the journalist personally can be good stories too. So if you know of an opportunity, use it. It's also very variable. I mean, you probably think that there's this grand scheme and we know what we're doing. Journalism is very seat of the pants. It's, what time of day is it? It's noon. So they've had one meeting today at the Boston Globe to decide what's in tomorrow's paper. They'll have another at 3:30. Maybe 80% of the stories will be the same from 10:30 to 3:30, but probably a couple of stories will fall off and something else will get elevated. It's very last minute. And there'll be like what's our lead art today? Excuse me, I'm going to walk out of the frame for a second. So, and I'm using newspaper, but media, online is similar. So there's a large picture on the front page of the Boston Globe today. Yesterday, they were sitting around saying, what's our picture for tomorrow? We've got to have a big picture. If your story has a great picture, you're going to have better luck getting it in a prominent position in the paper than if it doesn't. So always think about art. If you're trying for TV, video is great too for online or television. Art makes a huge difference in what I do. I can write a story for the business section I write for a lot. It'll be down page 600 words, the bottom of the page 600 words without art, and it'll be the centerpiece story if I have cool art at much longer length. Yeah. Mm. Exactly. And right. And writers used to be hesitant about, I don't want those pictures taken away from my words, but it really does elevate the words to have those pictures and to have some people learn visually. They don't learn by reading. And so having those multiple layers, I think really helps people understand and take in a story. I wanted to see a picture. Unfortunately, the old guy I just described was in Tennessee and I didn't get to meet him. But I desperately wanted to see a picture as I was writing because I needed to see him in order to write his story. I just think it's a basic human instinct to want to see things. I also think that I would love to have the money to do some explainer videos and graphics on diabetes, for instance. I write about diabetes all the time. I don't really understand what diabetes does to the body, and I can tell you that the patients I've talked to don't understand it either. What is it at the cellular, we say, oh, you need sugar for your cells to function, but what does that mean? What does that look like? And I think explainer videos are really helpful for that kind of thing. So if you ever have the money for that, personally think it's worthwhile. My point in bringing all of this up was that it's very variable whether you make it on the front page or inside the Metro section or the science, whatever, wherever the story plays. On Christmas, they might be desperate for a story. If you have a feel-good story on Christmas, you're going to get on the front page. The same feel-good story this week may not even make the paper. So, and I don't know if anybody is here from the communications department, but your communications department, in-house communications department, can usually be helpful with that. One other point I wanted to make is that what I do is different from what people on television do. And different formats have different needs. So we all hate jargon and acronyms. We all need quotes. We need somebody to say something that supports, if I had written about this older man, you want to hear his voice. Just as you want to see his picture, you want to hear what does this old guy who's just found his brother sound like. And so I need quotes from people, from doctors, and from patients often to write good stories. I need images. I look for personal stories, metaphors, and we all need sources who will make our lives easier because, as you can see, we're jumping around from a lot of different things. Commercial television, if you're talking to a TV person, you really want to talk kind of at the level of that 6-year-old. And I'm not being obnoxious, but that is the lowest common denominator, people with the least amount of time. You've got about 30 seconds, if you're lucky, maybe 15, to convey what you're trying to say. And they don't have a lot of voiceover. They don't talk a lot. They have you on camera saying the story. And so they need you to be articulate and summarize that story in 20 seconds. And they need visual information. It's called B-roll background. They might want to walk through the lab or the clinic with you. Radio, sorry, this slide didn't work out visually. Radio, the NPR people will have a little more expertise. They'll have beats. They'll know what they're talking about. The TV people will go from your story to a fire to a cop story. So they're not going to have any expertise at all. But radio doesn't get visuals to clarify what you say, so you have to be very descriptive in what you talk about. And they're also looking for audio. So if you work in a deadly silent lab, they're going to have a problem with that. You know, the machine that makes swishing noises is going to be something they're going to seek out. Print, I just came across this and loved it. It's irrelevant, but it's funny. People in print often have some specialization, like me. I've done this for 10 years now, health and science. I can paraphrase what you have to say. I don't have to, everything I put in my piece does not have to come directly from your mouth. I can summarize it and condense it. But I still need some quotes. I often need more sources than the television, radio people. I'll get back to that in a second. And also know that there are a huge range of print people, from USA Today to Nature to blogs. But sometimes it's the same reporter. So I've had people who will say, oh, you're writing for Nature, I can talk in the way the reductase, enzyme way. And I'm like, I'm still the same person who writes the story for USA Today. I may be writing for a different outlet, but I'm the same person hearing what you're saying. So you need to gauge who you're talking to a little bit. Are you blocking the sun, or do you have a question? Okay. You need to gauge who you're talking to and how much expertise they have, and be careful when you have the instinct to geek out, be careful. I talked about this, I think. Your business is a slow, careful process that often reverses itself. You accrete a lot of facts, tiny steps. Every study is part of a larger whole. You have big goals also to benefit society. What I do, I'm looking for dramatic change and big leaps. I'm not looking for tiny incremental change. I'm capturing a snapshot in time, a moment. I understand that there's a bigger picture, and you can help me see that bigger picture, but I'm looking today, right now, what's happening. I'm also focusing on the potential for the work. You think about genetics. When they first sequenced the human genome, many of us thought that medical problems would fall like dominoes because we now had the human genome sequenced. I think 10 years later, we understand that process is a little more complicated. I think journalism and the scientists we talked to, perhaps, contributed to that assumption about the dominoes falling, because we wrote about it like, oh, we now have the genetic code for X, we're going to cure all of these diseases. I think it's Huntington's, where we've had the genes since the late 1980s and still don't have any legitimate treatments. So, we've learned our lesson, but I think that's one of the dangers in my field of focusing too much on the potential for the work. I also try to go to the edge of what's true. I don't want to say anything that's false, but I want to say, I don't want to hedge every single thing that I say, because it becomes unreadable. I should have pulled an example of that, but if you read a sentence that says, this drug might someday help some people a little bit, right? It doesn't work. So I'm pushing to the edge of what I can say legitimately. This drug appears to be helpful for a large majority of people, whatever. I'm trying to say it in a way that people will be able to understand it. And my kind of big goals in the world are different than yours. I'm trying to help. I still see myself as a very idealistic person, but in a different way. I think my idealism is aimed differently. I'm trying to get people to understand their world, to help them live in a world that they can understand. And where you guys are thoughtful, careful, and deliberate, I'm flying by the seat of my pants, as you might be able to tell at the moment. But we need each other, right? I don't have my stories without you, and you need us. And I would say also, for some of these communication skills in general. I'm amazed at how many world-class scientists, Harvard, MIT, are like, oh, thanks so much for writing about me in the Boston Globe. And I'm like, why do you care about the 200,000 readers in the Boston Globe? Like, but my neighbor saw me in the paper. And they're like really excited by that. So I think that recognition is something we all crave recognition, right? So journalists help with that. Funding. You guys need grants, you need donors. Getting publicity for your work is something that you can send to the donors, and they will understand it where they might not understand the study that the abstract you send them. I also think it's a responsibility on the part of scientists, particularly those who accept public funding, to explain their work. You know, you're taking my tax dollars, you should explain what you're spending it on. And I also think that embryonic stem cells, for instance, got really out of control in the public's mind. I think in part because the scientists didn't take the time to explain to the public what they were doing. And it became this, you're killing babies story, instead of we're doing very basic science to try to understand blah, blah, blah. You know, that they lost control of their own story in part because they got behind it. And I think that and maybe evolution is the same thing a little bit, that because people don't understand this stuff, when the news breaks about it, they react in this emotional way and go back to what they do understand, which is dead babies, right? So I think it behooves scientists to talk to the public on an ongoing basis in order to help prevent things like that. Takes practice to do this well, I think. Again, a plug for I shouldn't be doing this because sometimes I'm at odds with the PR people, but these folks can help you guys a lot. Things you might want to do to prepare for an interview. You may want to spend 2 or 5 minutes doing what we did before. Just what am I saying? What's my point? Who am I? What do I do? Just take 5 minutes to think through and cut out think through the language that you might want to use that's jargon-free and that's direct. Think about the medium and the audience. Again, the quote might be different for Nature versus the local news. Know the medium and a little bit about the reporter if you can. Again, that's where your PR office can really help. I don't like it. I can tell when a researcher is reading something that they prepared for me. So I don't like to talk to people who are too prepared. It takes all the spontaneity out of the conversation. It sucks the interest and the life out of the conversation. And I'm going to get off the phone a lot faster with that person. A little plug for calling people back quickly, journalists, if you're ever in that moment. I might take your call if you call after I've reported a lot of the story, but when you're the first person to talk to me, you're shaping the story in my mind. You have a lot more control over me when you're the first person who calls me. And yeah, my definition of quickly is if it's for a daily paper within a half an hour or an hour, within a day or two for a longer feature. I'm just sort of posing and answering questions here that I've heard before from people. So some scientists have asked me, why do I always look for critics? Why, I'm writing about a study, why do I have to have a critic? I don't think of them as critics, but I need an outside perspective on a study. You guys are going to know when the flaws in a colleague's study, you're going to be able to spot that a lot faster than I am. And I don't know the right questions to ask. Why did you not double blind this study? You might cue me to ask a question like that where I might not have without it. And I'm not looking for you to badmouth your peers necessarily, although sometimes that can be good for me. I probably shouldn't tell you this, but I had an example last week where I was assigned to do a story. I had done an interview with the lead researcher, and I reached out to a couple of other researchers, and one of them got back to me and said, I don't want to talk about this. And that always sets bells off in my head. Well, why don't you want to talk about it? And he said, talk to this guy instead. So I set up a time to talk to this guy, and in the meantime, I talked to somebody else who convinced me it probably wasn't a story worth writing. And I emailed this guy back, and he said, yeah, I'm glad you did that. There's blood on this study. And I'm like, there's what? It's like, these people pursued their research while people were dying, and there's blood on this study, and this is a bad. Now, I wanted to quote, he wouldn't let me quote him on that, which is kind of disappointing for me as a journalist, but I understand as a scientist. But I didn't write that story because of that. Again, what do I need from you if I'm writing a story about your study? Why should I care? Why should our readers care? What makes this important outside the world of binary stars? And also, I need your help figuring out the context in which I present this study. I'm doing a piece that's under embargo, so I shouldn't be talking about this, an autism study coming out Monday, and they've looked at 7 kids. That's a ridiculously small study. I understand that. But it's also important and interesting. So I'm going to write about it, putting all those caveats in about how it's a pilot study, there are only 7 kids, we can't make any larger conclusions from this, but isn't it interesting that? And I need your help, I need other researchers' help to understand those caveats. Yeah, don't expect the reporters to have read your complete body of work. I have people who say, call me back when you've read my book. I call somebody else generally. And even when I have read the study, I often act as though I haven't because my readers haven't. So my first question to people usually is, what is this study about? Why did you do it? Because I want, and I'm also amazed at asking, when I ask a totally stupid question like that, how I'll get people go off almost to a person. They go off in a direction that I did not expect, that I would not have predicted based on the abstract and the study that I read. Because they put it, they've taken it out of context when they do a study, and when they tell it to me, they put it back in context. And so I understand it in a much deeper way than I would just reading the study. I also will often talk to you for half an hour, maybe even an hour, and I'll use 2 quotes or 1 paragraph. And I try to get in everybody who I have spent a lot of time with, but if I'm writing 200 words, forget it. And I need that time in order to understand the story. In order to condense it, I need the full thing, or a large picture, in order to write tight. Why don't I like to show quotes to people? Everybody likes to see their quotes. I find a lot of people will say, oh, you have to add my 17 colleagues to this. You can't, this wasn't my work alone. So I will often try to add so-and-so and colleagues, but I can't list 17 names in a news story of 300 words, I'm sorry. Or I've had people want to add, hydroxy reductase, whatever, to quotes, and I'm like, sorry. And oftentimes, with the Robin Williams story, I found out, I had just finished work for the day at 7 o'clock, and I was reading for fun, and I came across this news that Robin Williams had committed suicide, and I was reading some of the stories out of interest, and 15 minutes later, my editor calls and says, you're writing a story on Robin Williams. So, or I need you to write a story, and I said, on Robin Williams? How'd you guess? So, I didn't have time, it was done by 9. I did not have time to vet those quotes with people. Also, sometimes people ask, show me your story before it runs. I can't do that. We have very few ethics in journalism, but that is one of them. As a full story, it is a journalistic product. It is not a scientific product. And so I would get fired by the Boston Globe for showing it to you. We have sort of a double standard because I can show you the graphic, but I can't show you the story. Yeah, if anybody wants to ask about that. Why do we quote the same sources again and again? I know what I'm going to get from people who I've talked to before. I know they're going to be able to speak English, not science. I know that they'll call me back. I know that they give good metaphors and good examples. And I know their phone number. How to become one of those people, if you want to. Understand the reporter's needs. Understand a lot what I just finished describing. Be easy to reach, credible, reliable, articulate, plain spoken. A few things, nothing complicated. Sorry. And build a relationship. I mean, a lot of the people I talk to again and again are people I have a rapport with. I know they just got back from vacation. I know they broke their foot in, I'm thinking of one guy who I was just talking to who broke his foot on a trip to England. I know that about him because we've talked several times and we built a relationship together. And the next time something happens, I'm certainly going to go to him because I know what I'm going to get from him. I can keep going, but I think I'll stop there and open for questions. Anybody have a question? Yes? Oh, okay. So why and when should you go off the record? I mean, the guy telling me there was blood on the hands of those researchers was an off-the-record comment. I understand why he didn't want to say that on the record, much as I would like him to. And I would like him to so that I can write a story about what happened in that particular case, but also ethics in general, I think it's important to show the public that scientists are thinking about these things and where they do go off the rails sometimes. But I generally don't like it when people want to go off the record. You should be very careful going off the record with people, because there are some people who you can't necessarily trust. And off the record is a little bit negotiable. Does off the record mean I can't use that particular quote attached to your name? Does it mean I can't use that information when I talk to other researchers? What does off the record mean? You should always negotiate that if you are going to go off the record with somebody, because it is a little loose. Again, when people do go off the record with me, it's usually to explain scientific politics. Oh, I can't tell you that because, or, he used to work in my department and he left, and, we looked at his lab notes and they weren't very good, so that's why I don't want to comment on this study, or whatever. I could see somebody going off the record for that, and that might tell me that I don't want to quote that person, or don't think that person is a reliable source. So I appreciate it when people tell me that kind of information, even if it is off the record. Unlike politics, science journalists do not routinely use off the record quotes. I read a lot about mental health, and I understand why, but it really bothers me when people with mental health conditions won't go public, when I can't quote them about it, because I think that adds to the stigma. If I write a story from people, ADHD is actually one where a lot of adults don't want their name attached to that diagnosis. And I'm like, it's ADHD. 20% of kids under, school-age boys are medicated for ADHD. It's not like this, shouldn't be this stigmatizing thing, and yet people are afraid to come out about it. And I understand that, but I do think that it reinforces that. So I work to find people who will go on the record rather than quoting somebody who isn't. Yeah.
What do you do when you find out in the course of interviewing other sources that there's either false information being created or that there's a conflict?
Right. I mean, in the case that I just described about blood on their hands, I ended up not writing the story. Now that's an hour of my time, at least an hour of my time, for which I will not get remunerated. So it's a waste of my time. And I don't like to do that very often. But I do it when I don't feel comfortable writing about it. So the biggest power I have is to kill a story, basically. And I can reshape a story if I find out. I'm trying to think of a specific example. I guess with this autism study with 7 people, I've only talked to the researcher so far. I'm talking to a couple of other people over the next day or two. If one of them says, look, you can't, this is garbage, I might rethink doing that one again. Or I'm already planning to put caveats about, how it's only a pilot study of 7 kids. Does that, I validate my sources by talking to more than one person. I try to talk to 3 people at least for any story. And I will ask other researchers, what do you think of the quality of this research? Are you comfortable with these conclusions? That kind of thing. I am not a definitive, scientific, journalism is not science. What I say, I'm sure there are people who disagree with everything, with every study that comes out. I could find somebody who says it's not good for X or Y reason. And I do try to put some of those reasons in, well, autism is a great example, because anytime you write about anything showing, success in mice, people are going to run out and go buy it and give it to their kids. So I have to be very, very careful when I write about things like that, that it's not something potentially harmful. And no matter how many caveats you put in a story, people will run out and start doing it. So it's scary. It is scary.
Because the public brings the science down to a very rudimentary level.
Right.
And they want to believe it. So especially when it's something that they're desperate for answers or cures or something like that, what the journalist writes is very important.
And it almost doesn't matter, too. What I write, like I said, I can put 100 caveats in that story, but if they see somebody said this might work, they're going to go out and do it anyway. So I try to be cognizant of that and be very careful. We had that issue with Robin Williams with the suicide. So there's been a lot of talk over the decades that when journalists write about suicide, other people commit suicide. And so there's been a fear and an avoidance in journalism about writing about suicide. Now, with Robin Williams, obviously, he was a huge public figure. We had to write about it. I would not write about how he killed himself. Other people did, but the suicide advocacy community says don't do that because that's what people copy. Not that he killed himself, but how he killed himself. And so I think, but a lot of people did because they're not mental health reporters. They don't have that expertise. They haven't written about suicide before, and they didn't call the right person at 7:30, 8 o'clock at night when they were writing their story in an hour. So, you know, yeah.
For example, I'm speaking to the conglomerate of Western Massachusetts Parkinson's support groups about anxiety, depression, and Parkinson's disease because of Robin Williams and suicide.
Right.
So, no, it's obviously had a huge impact. That would normally not be a subject that we're interested in going out with research that went out. The studies that you participate in, something update.
Right.
This is the opposite.
Well, and I would argue that that's a great thing, that people are now interested in talking about depression and Parkinson's because, from what I've heard, it's a huge part of the reality of Parkinson's, and nobody talks about it. And so, to me, that's a win for journalism. I mean, obviously, it's horrible that it happened to Robin Williams and that he had recently been diagnosed with Parkinson's, but that's where media can, I think, make a real difference by putting a spotlight on issues that would otherwise be ignored. Exactly. Takes it out of the closet, right. Did you have a question? Yeah.
Well, my question is to be also
Okay.
you're obviously very long with journalism. There are obviously rules that are followed. But in your opinion, how much of what you do is just your gut?
A lot of what I do is my gut. There are very few rules in journalism. I should say I never took a journalism class until I taught one. It is not. Journalism is not a profession the way medicine is a profession. We were never professionalized. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, when all these other professions got exams and standardized whatevers, that never happened in journalism. We were a bunch of cigar-chewing, hat-wearing people until about 30 years ago. When I came into this profession, I knew people like that who never set foot in the doors of a college. And during the course of my career, we've gone from the people who hung out at the bar after work every night, to now a lot of us are overeducated, out of touch with real people, don't know anybody who doesn't believe that, who doesn't know that the earth doesn't revolve around the sun. I mean, we're very isolated actually from the general public now, which isn't necessarily a good thing for journalism. I think that has had something to do with why we've lost our franchise with the public, and why those numbers are heading south. But so we've become professionals de facto, but not with any paperwork or exams behind us. We only have our own personal ethics, and we don't plagiarize. We don't lift other people's quotes and comments without attribution. That I would say is a no-no across the board. We aim for accuracy and honesty, and beyond that, we're kind of on our own.
Plagiarizing is quite a skill because most of the young people plagiarize and scientists do it. So I have to become.
Well, and the way I do that is just by talking to people. When I talk to somebody, I'm quoting them, and I'm not plagiarizing somebody else. They may be, but I'm not. Anybody else? Yeah. That's fantastic. And to me, that's like, the heavens just opened up and the angels started singing. I mean, that's what this is all about.
I guess I know how to do this little day-to-day talk to my neighbors thing, but I don't really know how to go that next leap. I mean, I tell you that ALS research is long as they COVID.
Right.
In any field, that's true, right? But how do you, I mean, or does it even matter?
I mean, I think that's a personal decision. Does it matter to you to get in the newspaper or on TV or on, right? Well, but so the Harvard and MIT people are great at this, right? Now, are they great at it because that's who Harvard and MIT hires? Or are they great at it because they've learned on the job that that's how they advance? I don't know. And, we're at a women's forum. Men tend to be better at this than women because the women are afraid to oversell themselves and afraid to get personal. Should you? Yeah, I mean, if you have a great story idea, I absolutely want to hear about it. And any journalist is going to want to hear about it. If it's the kind of thing that you say to your husband at night, and then he tells 3 people at his office, and they tell 3, it's the kind of thing that goes viral over the water cooler is going to make a good story. The ice bucket challenge is a great example where, it was a couple of people and then it exploded and it became news because it had gone viral. In terms of whether you want to do this yourself, I think that's a personal decision you have to make, but I do think that it can help your career it can hurt your career too, I suppose, if you're out there and somebody, you become the target of the anti-vaccine people or whatever, that can be difficult. I know people who've had that situation happen to them. But, I mean, as somebody who does what I do all the time, I believe that public information, communicating with the public, is essential for a democracy, for a society, for people's health. I'm dumbfounded at how much of medicine is now based on genetics, and the public, my editors don't understand. I had an editor say, can't you get the letters DNA out of this story? And it was a story about DNA. I'm like, no, I can't. And this is a college-educated, top-ranking editor at the Boston Globe, and that's who we're dealing with, and to me, it's a shame and a huge problem, and we all have to be part of that solution, in whatever way feels comfortable to you, I guess I would say. Yeah. Right. It's hard, and it's not, I write about a segment of something. I'm not telling the whole story. I'm telling a piece. Here's what happened today. Here's what this study says and how to put it in context with. So, I don't know, I'm just thinking of the first ALS thing that comes to mind. Kevin Egan at Harvard, I've been following some of his research. He's got a drug that he's going to be testing in people with ALS later this year. And it came out of work he did with stem cells. He took skin cells from people with ALS and grew them out in a dish, into neurons and grew them out in a dish, and then tested a bunch of compounds and found a couple of promising ones, and he's starting one in trials. So I just gave that to you in 250, 300 words. I could do it longer. I want to do it longer. My editors don't always let me. But I mean, I can take almost anything and tell it to you at different levels of depth, I guess I would say. Does that make sense? And I think actually what I am good at is taking a complicated story and telling it and hopefully still being accurate. I'm obviously missing subtleties, but I try to get the essence of it across. And people tell me that I do that. So, but yeah, I'm not telling the history of ALS and every drug out there and every attempt at curing ALS. I'm telling a very small slice of that story that just happens to be relevant today. And I get a lot of when I get complaints from the public, it's that, you didn't talk about this. And I was like, I can't. I can't talk about everything in one story. And personally, that's what I love about the internet, actually, because you can link from things to other things. So I could link in my story about ALS to an ALS Society page that had all these other drug targets under development. But I can't do that in one 500-word story. Other people, other questions? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I've met physicists who've written the ultimate textbooks, the gold standards. They can take concepts and they can reduce them down to 1 or 2 sentences, and for some reason they have such control
Right.
on what they're talking about, they can teach a third-grade class.
Right.
It's just, again,
And some of that is innate. You know, some people just can describe things visually and clearly and simply that anybody can understand. But some of it is practice, too. Some of it is just they sat around thinking about that and tried to explain it. You know, maybe they had a college roommate who hated physics. And they're like, no, you got to love physics. I love physics. And they started explaining it to their college roommate. And that's how, you know, who knows, but I'm making that up. But you know, there might have been a moment in their lives when they felt the need to explain it, and it became habitual for them. So I think anybody can do it within reason. Maybe that's not true, but in my experience, what I was trying to say here, what you need to do, from my perspective, is you need to pull back a little bit. You need to give me the broader context, not just this study found this drug might work in ALS. You need to say, hey, we got this cool thing. We're able to take brain cells or skin cells and turn them into brain cells now, which we've never been able to do before. We can make thousands of them. We can test the drug 1,000 times and see what works. Like that, to me, is a cool story. But I needed somebody to help me get a step back from it in order to see that story from this study. And I think, again, some people do that just naturally, and some people have to practice that. Why should people care? Why should someone care about your research? Why does wound healing matter, right? I mean, innately we know, okay, we all get cuts, we want it to heal, but, you know, maybe the Department of Defense is funding your research because soldiers need wound healing, you know, and helping the reporter understand ways in which the wound healing work that you do might help them, might help their editor, might help the military, can be a way to put that in that context. That's more interesting for the general public. Other questions? Okay, thanks.